Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Ackert. We're back for day 3 of NSCI 306. We're starting week 2, which means you'll be writing your first response paper and preparing your topics for the first main paper. I said a little bit about the assignment and how to structure arguments in general in the last couple of videos. Today we're just going to do one video because the second hour will be discussion. So we'll meet live here on the times that I showed in the last time to talk about Jared Diamond's and Fred Pierce's essays. And as we get to the end of today's video, I'll share some resources introducing you to those authors and kind of the rhetorical situations, as well as some sample discussion questions. I encourage you to write your own discussion questions as you prepare for that class, so you have something to contribute and to kind of get you thinking about what you might write about for both of the homeworks for this week, which involve those readings. So let me start up our lecture notes here. This particular meme has nothing really to do with writing, but I thought it was extremely clever, kind of playing on the music posters that you see of different bands. But if you look a little closely, we have the Offspring instead of the Offspring, Pandemic at the Disco. That one I thought was really clever. For those of us who are in the 90s, the No Kids on the Block or the Foo Fighters. And going even further back, we have Men Out of Work, Depressed Mode, and Billy Idol. I do kind of wish they'd worked in Disturbed somewhere, because these days, if your voice sounds like you're probably down with the sickness. Today, I'm going to go over the week 2 assignments, and my main topics will be looking at how to use context in your arguments. I introduced the they say, I say model last time in terms of setting up your main argument. So I want to continue that and show you some benefits of applying that in your own writing. And then we're going to look at that specifically in terms of responding to others' arguments. So as you read in They Say, I Say for today, you can approach any given argument by agreeing, disagreeing, or doing some of both. And the idea in all 3 of those situations is to advance the conversation somehow. So I'm going to share some tips for doing that, as well as some templates that you can use to structure your arguments. That'll be especially helpful in response paper 1. Speaking of which, here is your assignment for that first paper. That is due the night of Tuesday, April 14th. This is a fairly compact paper, so you're going to need to do some planning and drafting to make your argument in 300 to 500 words. And you have the choice of responding to anything you find interesting in Jared Diamond's essay, Easter's End. Our discussion later today will be a good chance to practice that, but follow the instructions for establishing claims, especially establishing a thesis claim that we looked at last time, and defend that argument as you go through. So it will help to go back over your notes and my lecture notes for the April 9th lecture, so you can say something with more of a kind of a so what angle to it, and less just saying, well, here's something that I noticed or I thought was interesting. I want to see how you respond in terms of making an argument, whether you're agreeing or not. We'll go over to some techniques for that a little bit later on as well. In that paper, I would like you to analyze and interpret at least 2 quotes from the article, and I want you to consider how they work rhetorically. What sort of argument is Diamond making, and how is he doing that? As you know, paper 1 will be using a lot of these same skills. So whatever your opinion on Diamond's subject matter, this is your chance to show how does he go about approaching that. What is important to him? How does he use maybe certain rhetorical appeals? If you want to read ahead a little bit to those materials from the Writing Commons website, that's linked on Blackboard for you. Or even just what sort of techniques do you see in how he makes his claims? And we'll look into the context a little bit later this hour. So to prepare here, you definitely need to read through the article several times. I recommend at least 3. Annotate it. If it helps, you can print that out, or you can mark up a PDF or HTML copy on your computer. Again, going back through the techniques that I covered in the last lecture will help figuring out what are the key terms here, how are they working, maybe where there's some interesting tensions or weaknesses, because you're welcome to disagree with parts or all of Diamond's argument and show how that might be improved. So you have a lot of freedom for the topics here. That is sort of a double-edged sword. So you have the ability to write on something that interests you, but you also want to kind of keep it relevant to the stuff we've been working on and the techniques that we have there. I would encourage you to email me or stop by office hours. Those will start on Tuesday, April 7th. If you have questions about a potential topic, or just saying, hey, is this an idea that I could work with here? I'd be glad to work through that with you. For Thursday, April 16th, you're going to be tackling Pierce's article called The Battle Over Climate Data. So I'll talk about the context of that a little bit later today. And I want you to focus in this particular exercise on tone. So it's a little shorter than the response group, about 250 words. And I want you to address specifically, how does he describe both sides of this controversy, because he's covering different opinions on climate change and its causes and kind of the rhetorical approaches there. And pay particular attention to how he characterizes the people and the groups involved. One of the big issues that comes up in Pierce's article is what counts as legitimate, what is real science, who is an appropriate authority, and why should we bother to listen to them? And we still have those questions come up in a lot of discourse, a lot of conversations about science. Certainly these days, we've got some experts from different organizations, for instance, the CDC, who get a lot of airtime, and they are giving certain advice and certain approaches, but there's also people giving pushback. Maybe there are politicians with different agendas or different priorities. Maybe they're saying, well, yeah, this is potentially a good idea, but maybe we don't have to ignore it. One soundbite that got a lot of playtime this past couple of days is when the CDC officially made his recommendation to wear a mask when you're out in public. President Trump integrated that into his speech, but then he said something like, well, yeah, but it's not a requirement. This is something that they're just recommending. I'm probably not going to do it. And so that is an instance of engaging with someone else's ideas, and then you can analyze how that works, what sort of argument is being made there. Back to the Pierce assignment, though, it will be pretty clear when you read through it that he has certain sympathies. He prefers one side to the other. And so I want to look at how that works. How do his biases toward one side of this issue affect how he presents the information? And this is going to be a very important question for you also in Major Paper 1. This is a good testing ground for that. Even though Pierce's article itself is too old to use for that assignment, you're going to be doing the same kind of work. And the last question I want you to address in this exercise is whether this tone is appropriate and professional. Now, Pierce is writing as a professional journalist, and so I want you to see, how is that working? Is what he's doing here rhetorically appropriate for his audiences? Does this affect how we view him as readers, and so on? So we'll talk about how that works kind of at the nuts and bolts level in our discussion, but I want you to be thinking of that also for your paper. Do notice this is a pretty short paper, so you'll want to watch your word count as you cover each of these areas. Figure helps 250 to maybe 300 words for the whole thing. So plan to cover each of these sets of questions in about 100 words each. So that is coming up this week, and you'll turn those in on Blackboard as usual. I want to transition then to look at some rhetorical benefits of using this they say, I say model. And some of this is sort of scattered in the chapters that you're reading. Some of it is sort of drawn more holistically from the book itself. I wanted to fill in some of those gaps there because we're not reading every single chapter there. The first big advantage here is it helps you clarify what you're talking about and who you're talking to. And that works for both you and your audience. One thing we'll look at when we go to the rhetorical appeals is how changes in those variables, especially the audience, can make an important difference in how something is received. In fact, one of the exercises you'll be writing in a couple of weeks is asking for money. You're going to write an email asking a certain audience to give you $100, and we'll look at what has to change depending on what the audience goes there. So setting up a context for your argument is a good first step for that. And partly that just works on a linguistic level. We use different terms in different ways, depending on who we're talking to. And that might go back to denotation and connotation, as I mentioned in a previous lecture. Certainly, if you are writing for an audience of specialists in some way, then you're going to bring up that jargon. And that's going to be sort of a mark of insider knowledge. That's how this idea of a discourse community works, that there are certain people who talk a certain way, who understand certain things, who kind of use sort of these linguistic shortcuts. But it also extends to how we use language strategically. If you are talking to an audience that you know is bilingual, then it might make sense to do what's called code switching. It's a really fun linguistic phenomenon. Code switching is when you move back and forth between multiple dialects or languages to communicate different tones or to talk to different people, or even just to kind of give a certain register to what you're saying. I remember, last quarter, I was sitting in the classroom in one of my English 306 classes, and they were doing a peer workshop. So most of the class was the students talking to each other. They kind of read over each other's papers and share their feedback. And a large majority of Cal State students speak English and Spanish, generally with similar fluency. And so one of these pairs of students were going back and forth really rapidly. And, I was sitting there grading papers. I was trying to kind of listen in and make sure everything was going smoothly. And I noticed that every other sentence was switched back to Spanish. And it was really interesting to me because I noticed that something about the way my student spoke, like he would speed up when he went into Spanish. And it would seem to be kind of almost a more intimate move, like saying, hey, I'm going to speak in our language now instead of this other language. Or maybe it indicates, I really want to communicate this, but I know the concept better in one language or the other. I find it fascinating how this works, especially among different audiences or kind of different situations. For example, my mom's family, they all grew up in Japan. My grandparents were missionaries there. And so my mom and all of her siblings learned Japanese as kids. And sometimes they will just pull that out in situations where they're talking to each other. And that might indicate, I want to communicate a certain idea. But it could also be, I want to create a new linguistic situation. And this was very helpful when my grandmother was kind of in the late stages of her life. She unfortunately developed Alzheimer's and dementia. But we found that there were certain concepts that she remembered in Japanese, but not in English. And so sometimes when she was struggling to remember a word or figured out what a relationship was, my mom would remind her of the Japanese word, says, oh, okay, this. And that would somehow jog her memory in a different way than trying to do it in English. So there's certainly linguistic elements to setting up the context, and that could start with something as basic as what language are you using? You're also going to find that your audiences will understand you differently, for better or worse, based on how well they know the broader context. So again, think of conversations. If you come in to a conversation between two other people, whether that's written or spoken or however that's working, and you've only caught just a few basic things, it's very easy to get confused. It's like starting a movie in the middle or starting a TV series in like season 3. How are you going to catch up? And so you might have to backtrack a little bit and say, okay, wait, who are these characters and what's going on? Conversely, if you have that background, you can sort of skip some of those steps. So if you turned on a news report on CNN or Fox News or CBS or any of the stations right now, they're probably not going to start by saying, so there's this thing called a coronavirus, and this particular brand is called COVID-19, and it's really, really bad, guys, and it's kind of spreading everywhere, and you need to shelter in place or wear masks or whatever the current topic is. They're just going to start in assuming that you know what they're talking about. So that if for some reason you weren't following that, then it's going to be very difficult. So setting up that context is a big help to your audience. This also helps you in setting up a compare contrast, and that's going to be one of your assignments for a future research or future response paper rather. You're going to look at how two different essays approach a similar topic differently. We'll be reading some of the details of that, so I don't want to get into it too much right now. But it can give you another set of analytical tools because it's never just one context. We're thinking, how might this impact different parts of our world? How might this be important for different kinds of people? And so we never just have one angle on a big news story like the spread of COVID-19. It's going to be, well, what are the particular economic consequences for this group? How is this industry or this business or this region dealing with this? How is this going to make a difference for these people? And so one of the rhetorical choices you make in framing your argument and setting up this context is deciding what's going to be relevant to them and potentially how can you connect those to each of their interests. How are you going to keep their attention in working on this? So as I lecture, one of the things that's always kind of in the front of my mind is how is this going to connect to the graded assignments? Because I know you are here, not just because you have a burning desire to learn how to write better, but because you are getting credit for this. You have a grade attached to a lot of the work you're doing in this course. And so you want to know how to meet my goals, the standards I've set out and the university has set up for getting an A. That's why I finished on my first lecture with how to get an A at NSCI 306. Lastly, the more specific you can get about your context, the easier it will be for you to establish something clear and relevant, not just for your audience, but a way to limit your argument in productive ways. And think about this not in terms of, I can't say as much, but think about this as setting up boundaries around what you want to talk about. And you'll see this a lot in scholarship of all sorts, especially in scientific scholarship. You're not going to solve every single problem about how to improve the efficiency of this gadget or how to treat this disease better. What you can do is say, here are the parameters that we are investigating. Here are the details that are important. And here is why I want to look at them in this particular way. And so you don't have to say, since the beginning of time, there has always been X, or that people have always cared about this. That may be true. Don't say it anyway. Instead, say, here's the specific group of people who cares about this. Here is why this is important. Because then it's sort of liberating. You don't have to worry about making this relevant to every single person on earth. You can say, I'm talking to this group, and all these other groups, this is not for you, and that's okay. I had a student in NSCI 306 last quarter, and she was a geology major. Very, very bright student. And she wrote her research paper, it's paper 2 in our course, on the particular fossil records, and I may be misstating some of this, of kinds of grasses in Southern California, and went into a lot of detail about how those were formed and roughly how old they were and all this stuff. And on one hand, I read that and I thought, Personally, I don't care about any of this because I'm not a geologist. I don't have that context. I don't have that area does not appeal to me in terms of my professional research. But I could tell that it was important to her and the people kind of in that discourse community, the people she was talking to. And so it made perfect sense for her to say, let me look at how C3 and C4 grasses grow here and why they're relevant and what I can learn about this in preparation for my future work here. And I encourage you to do the same thing in your research projects, especially, no matter how esoteric it might seem. And so the second major benefit of using context is giving your argument this starting point, a specific point of origin. This is a great time saver because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you make an argument. You can say, I am starting with what this one person has said in this one context, or what this group has said, or what there's this particular idea. And rather than say, well, a lot of people have talked about this giant concept, and then trying to cover all of them, respond to them, you can say, I'm going to let these other people set the terms in some way, lay the foundation so that I know what I can do next. How can I contribute to this particular conversation without having to worry about saying everything about everything to everybody? As I'll show you a little bit later today, you can also use a combination of agreement and disagreement to do that more effectively. Because it can be really helpful to say, you know what, I agree with your starting point here, but if that's all you have to say, then you're going to have trouble writing your paper. So in your response paper, you can start with, Jared Diamond makes a great point about ecology or history or understanding these particular sources. But what I want you to do is extend that. Show that you are somehow enriching the conversation by some contribution you make. And as you get into more scholarly writing, whatever the field is, you'll find that pattern over and over. Here's what's been done. This is why it was helpful, but this is also why it was insufficient. Doesn't mean it was bad scholarship or that you didn't like it or you disagreed with it. It means there's something else that we need to do here. And that's where you can set up your starting point for your article. I have found that this is not just about giving you a good place to start, but it helps keep your focus throughout the paper. Because you're going to know a lot more about your topic and your ideas than you will have room to explain in that paper. And so by saying, this is where I want to start specifically, it helps, it's sort of a promise to your reader. This is where the conversation is going to go. And there may be stuff that's outside the bounds of this argument. You actually see that move a lot in scholarship. They'll say, you know what, this is a big, hugely important issue. It's complicated, and there's all this stuff here that I'm not going to talk about because I want to focus just on this one thing. It's a good discipline for the rest of your writing. Thirdly, context gives you a sense of legitimacy. On a very basic level, this shows that you have done your homework. It's always a good thing to demonstrate to your professor, right? One way we can do that is by adding direct quotes. So you'll notice that in a lot of the assignments, I ask you to engage with specific quotes. Now, a large part of that in terms of the skills in this course is to help you analyze texts. That's a big thing in a writing course. But it's also a little more basic than that. It's showing that you're not just dealing with the overall gist, kind of the abstract or the summary of what's going on here, but you're dealing with how specifically that argument works. Think of trying to describe a TV show or a movie to someone who's never seen it. You might be able to start with, so there's this world and like there's this guy named Neo and he's kind of normal, but then he takes this red pill one day and he realizes that we're actually all on a computer. And just at that level, it's going to be really confusing if you haven't seen the matrix. And so you have to get more specific. You have to show, all right, so here's exactly how this is set up. And I found that in those areas where you're really excited about a topic or a text, it's easy to get bogged down in those details until your audience say, okay, hang on, what's actually happening here? Another rhetorical element of this is it shows an openness to continuing that conversation. And we're going to look at this a little bit later this quarter in terms of using what They Say I Say calls a naysayer in anticipating and responding to counter arguments. But this is a very healthy attitude to have towards any argument that you make. You are contributing, you are confident in your work, but you realize that you do not actually know everything there is to know about this topic. And so that you can say, you know what, there's more we could talk about, or there's something else that could be said here, and I want to, I look forward to your response, kind of thing, as you continue that conversation. So it's as much a mental and kind of an ethical move as it is a rhetorical move. And on a more basic level in terms of persuasion, if you can show why your contribution is important, not just, hey, we know more about this topic, good, so what? What does this let us do? How does this unlock an idea or a model? How is this going to improve future work? What are the implications here? Then your audience is more likely to appreciate that. Again, I do this all the time when I'm planning lectures and when I'm teaching. My goal is that every time I get in front of the camera this quarter or stand up in front of the class in every other quarter, and I talk at you, by the end of that, you can do something better. You can understand a concept more, you can write better, you can understand how an assignment is going to work. Because otherwise it's just, hey guys, let me tell you about all this cool stuff. So it's not just a presentation, it's kind of persuading you this is going to be relevant to the work you do. And a big part of that, as we'll get into with the rhetorical appeals a little bit later this quarter, is establishing authority or professionalism. It's called ethos in the Greek model of rhetoric. One of the questions that I'm having you look at for your response to Pierce is whether his tone is appropriate and professional for the setting that he's in. And there could be judgment calls on that. But on a basic level, anytime you show that you know the conversation, you know the context of what's come before, this makes people more likely to listen to you. So that again, think of all of the news conferences we're seeing from the governors and from doctors and researchers about COVID-19. If they are able to cite specific progress or specific models or even the numbers here, then that makes us more likely at least to listen to them. We may still disagree with them. That's okay. But we know that they have an informed opinion and not just saying, well, yeah, I think that we should totally do something about this disease thingy because it's bad. It's really, really bad. #sad. That's going to be less convincing and less authoritative because it's not accounting for what's come before there. So we have set up a context for an argument, and often you end up doing this relatively quickly in your introduction. That's why intros and thesis statements take a while to get right. And once you have set up that context, you're in a much better position to respond to others' claims. So that's the other big thing I want to tackle today. I want to look at 3 models for doing that. And I think this dovetails nicely both with the They Say I Say model and with the Arguing Like a Grown-Up model. The main thing I want to communicate here is that when you argue like a grown-up, you advance this conversation in productive and useful and hopefully mature ways, regardless of whether you agree or disagree. So that I would say it's equally unhelpful just to have a conversation where everyone is saying, yep, definitely that. Yes, that's true. Everything you said is 100% correct. Yay. As it is to have a conversation where you say the opposite. Nope, you're totally wrong. You're an idiot. Stop talking. Please, I beg you, nothing you say is correct in even the slightest degree. Because the conversation is not happening in either of those situations. It's just exclusively saying yes, exclusively saying no. So that as you're expressing that agreement or disagreement, you're still saying, okay, here's how I think this is the right or wrong way to go about this. And here's what we're going to be able to do as a result of that. So your first job, and you'll do this in pretty much all of your papers, especially your response papers, is to identify something specific to respond to. And I hope you'll be able to practice that in our discussion for the second half of this class. But here are the overall models. You can agree with the author's claim, but I want you to extend it or apply it to a new context. And I'll walk through each of these in a couple of minutes. You can disagree and then explain how and why that's working. What specifically do you reject or say, where can we improve this? Or you can agree with part of it, but disagree with another part. And again, explain why. And this is the key task in all of these is to show your work. And if you just had a flashback to math class, I apologize. But you still do this in papers. You're not just saying, Jared Diamond is wrong and he's probably a big fat idiot who kicks puppies. Because while that could be a claim of sorts, you haven't done anything to defend it or to show why your view is important. What difference does this make? And go back to our physics example in the thesis lecture last time. Before we get into the models, I do want to give you kind of a shout out to a page that I think does this really well. It's mostly a Facebook page. I think he's recently expanded into Twitter. It's called the Meme Policeman. And as you can tell from my lecture notes, I love memes, but I also recognize that they have certain rhetorical limits. It's very easy to oversimplify an argument in a meme, or even to make misleading or even false claims based on cherry-picked data or data that doesn't actually connect. And so what the Meme Policeman does is takes the memes that usually make some economic or political claim and does the research, says, okay, what is this actual number here? Does this stand up to scrutiny? How do these two ideas connect? Even stuff as simple as, what is the actual source of this picture? Because you've all seen those where it's like, so here's the top picture where everything is good, and then meanwhile in Trump's America or in Pelosi's America or whatever you want to say, here's a picture of things looking terrible. There's a big deal, this is several months ago now, when one of the controversies we had was separating children from parents at the southern border of the US-Mexico border. And so there are all these photos circulating of people in what they were often called cages, or certain Congress critters called them concentration camps. The problem was that the images were used completely out of context, or even were like 3 or 4 years old from Obama's presidency. And so people who were using them would say, look, this is what Trump is doing. Like, well, actually, this is what Obama did, but even then, it's not really what you were saying. So that's the kind of work the Meme Policeman does. And there's a page on Facebook. I believe there's a Twitter account now and a page on Patreon. It's worth your time just to read through the analysis. And more than once, I read through that and said, oh, I totally bought into the meme that I thought was accurate, but actually I believe something that was false or misleading based on that. So it's a good kind of check on our meme culture. So let me walk you through these methods of responding to others' claims, and I'll show you some templates for each one of them. These are also available in your textbook. First, if you are agreeing, the idea here is to start from common ground. In fact, there's an entire model of argument called the Tolman model that does just this. Rather than start with, here's my claim and I'm going to defend it to the death, you say, all right, here are these two sides of this disagreement, this controversy. Where do they agree on something? And that might be they both want to pursue similar goals, or they both want to solve the same problem. You can approach that this way here as well. So where is the common ground between you and the author? And even if you go on to say, overall, there's parts of this I don't like, which we'll cover in the third part of this, having that common ground is a good place to start. So some ways in which this works out very often. The whole idea of a recommendation system is based on agreement. Amazon does this. Netflix does this. Amazon Video does this because they say, here are the characteristics of this thing we know you like, or at least you have maybe bought something in this category, or you have gone to this website, or you have said this word around your smart speaker, and Alexa says, psst, they totally want to buy this. And sometimes this is going to be really effective. Generally, if I like a particular movie I watch on Netflix or Amazon, or if there's a book, I buy a lot of science fiction ebooks on Amazon, then it's helpful to say, okay, what have other people who bought this read or enjoyed or rated highly? And so that can work as well. But it's only as strong as the data that prompts that recommendation. And sometimes it's not particularly relevant after that one experience or purchase or something like that. Or maybe you watched 10 minutes of a movie, you thought, oh man, this is terrible, I'm never watching this again. And then Amazon comes back the next day and says, hey, we noticed you watched this movie, you would totally love this. No, stop it. I remember several years ago, I was Christmas shopping, and I wanted to buy something for my brother, who at the moment was in nursing school. And my brother's kind of hard to shop for, but I figured I'm going to get him something that he can use to study for his nursing exams. And so I looked up all these study guides and drug references and everything there. And I found a few books that I think were helpful for him. But then for a month afterwards, Amazon thought I was in nursing school. And so it started to recommend all these books to me and textbooks and references like, really, guys, this is the only time I will ever purchase something like this. And a lot of companies will do that. They'll keep sending you catalogs or emails. Like, seriously, this is the one-time thing. Please leave me alone. Another potential way this can kind of backfire is trying to get you to buy the same kind of product over and over. Now, for some products, this works really well. If I have bought a particular brand of coffee, well, eventually I'm going to run out of coffee and I might have to buy more. But when I was shopping for engagement rings, I did a fair amount of research into different jewelers and different styles and everything, and then ended up, my fiance, now my wife, went to a jeweler and said, oh, look, there's one that's perfect. Let's just buy that one. So all the internet research didn't really help that much. But Facebook especially latched onto that and decided for the next 3 months, I wanted to buy another engagement ring. And I have to wonder what went through the designer's head when they set up that algorithm, because if you're shopping for an engagement ring and you actually buy one, and then it's for some reason you need another one 3 months later, that's not terribly likely, because that probably means you've moved on to a different fiance, and you probably are, that's moving a little bit quick. So I don't know how they set that up. So there are weaknesses in the system, but it can work overall. Here's what you liked, therefore try this. Another useful approach here in rhetorical terms is called priming. I mentioned earlier, you're going to be writing a letter to ask people for money to cover educational expenses in one of your later exercises. And you can use priming really well in a context like this, especially if it's like a conversation and not just a one-way communication. You might start with a question where you get the easy yes. So you might say to your parents, hey, you guys want me to succeed, right? Or you want me to get good grades? Well, I definitely need this to buy this textbook or to do this thing better. And the scale can be anywhere there. It can be finding that need, getting that yes, and saying, oh, you definitely need that. Look at commercials sometimes. They'll say something like, do you want to improve your life? I mean, who's going to say no at that point? Who's going to say, nope, my life sucks and I like it that way? Say, oh, yeah, I totally want to do that. And they might get specific. Do you want to lose 20 pounds? Do you want to eat better? Do you want a better relationship with this person or that person? Their goal is to prime you to respond more positively to the request. So you agree with them, and then they say, well then, let's extend that, because if you really like this, then you must do this. The other side of that is the bait and switch. Again, advertisements work really well for case studies here, because many times they will promise a certain result or a certain product and then say, oh, yeah, it's not actually going to do that. So they might reel you in with a phrase like, hey, 0 payments for 90 days, or 0% APR on a credit card, or look, internet for $9.99 a month. Oh, I totally have $9.99 a month. And then they say, by the way, it's actually going to be $79.99 a month after the first 3 months. But we're not going to tell you that up front, because that's a much less flashy approach. Our classic example here is Lucy and Charlie Brown, Little Peanuts comic. Lucy, many times over the course of the comic, holds the football, promises Charlie Brown that he can run up and kick it, and then, wouldn't you know it, the last second she pulls it away. Perhaps one of the original memes before we actually had memes. Charles Schultz, very prescient. Here's some rhetorical templates you can use to set up an agreement and extension move. You can cite your own experience. Again, think, how relevant is this? And is this going to be sufficient data? Because in some cases, your own experience might be particularly helpful, and a personal recommendation that could be good. So you should go see the movie Parasite, because my wife and I saw it. It was great and really enjoyed it. But there may be limits to that. I probably would not tell an 8-year-old, hey, you should go see Parasite. It was a great movie. I still think it's a great movie, but probably not a great movie for an 8-year-old. You can also cite evidence. We see this all the time. There are scientific studies on this topic proving this data or demonstrating this trend. Again, we see this all the time in news briefings on COVID-19. You can look at how someone else, that could be another person, another institution, another group, and say, they have been doing this well, so we should take what they're doing and try it in this new context. And notice the variables are changing here. So we, in this context, we're not trying to do Y exactly, we're trying to do Z. And so, again, there's room for a counter argument. Maybe the thing that makes X successful is unique to its context, or trying to do this particular task that's not going to carry over. You can also agree by thinking in terms of metaphors. Again, there are limits to this, but it can be helpful, often to break down a process. So if I tell you, and as I may have already done in a previous lecture, that learning to write is sort of like learning to drive, I am assuming that you drive on a fairly regular basis. This is a part of your experience, and that you can see a connection between this part of driving and this part of writing. And that may not hold true for all of my audiences, and they may have learned in very different contexts, or maybe they don't drive anymore, or whatever it is. This is sort of a classic move. We need to extend this. So this is a great start, but it needs to go further. And I use this move quite often when I am giving rough draft feedback on your papers. I will say something like, you've got some good material here, but push it further. This is a good start to a thesis, but what about this? This is an interesting argument, but I'd like to see more of X, Y, or Z in the second draft. Similarly, you could say we can build on this foundation to do something more. So This one and the last one are similar. They both say X is positive, but while the first one is saying it's a good start, but we need to kind of keep going along those lines, the second one suggests that X is kind of done, and now we can use that to accomplish something else. So you'll see this move a lot in scholarly essays. We'll say, now that we have proven this, now that we have this data, now that we have shown that this model or this mechanism or whatever is workable, we can do something else with it. We can do further experiments. We can apply this maybe in our own work. Maybe someone else can do this work for us. The second approach, of course, is to disagree with someone productively. Here is our requisite cat meme. And I often want to think like this. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just explaining why exactly it is that I'm right. Because whether we are that blunt about it, that is the starting point for our disagreement. Now, you can break this down into several components of an argument. As I mentioned earlier, you want to start by identifying a specific idea and base that on a specific critique of part of the argument. Maybe you think, you know what, the content here is good, but the approach is all wrong. Maybe you think that I like the way you're going with this, but your conclusion is way off the rails. However you're doing that, you can look at different parts of the argument, the assumptions, premises, or conclusions, and use that to challenge how the argument works. Let me give you a few definitions. An assumption is an undefended and sometimes an unarticulated belief about some facet of how the world works. And this one is a little tricky because many arguments will not actually say, so this is how what I'm assuming about how this is going to go forward. Because at some level, you just kind of have to take it for granted that this is going to work. If you had a physics paper, it's probably not going to start with 5 or 10 pages on why we can trust empirical data, or why what we see, touch, taste, smell, etc. is a measure of what's actually going on in the world. Now, if you had a philosophy paper, they might spend the entire 30 or 40 pages saying, can I actually do that? And you get into territory like, well, Kant, among others. Whether or not they articulate this, their underlying beliefs, you can still use this as grounds for a critique. So they assume that this is how this works, but actually it doesn't go that way. There are also the premises. These are a little more visible, and this is the evidence that's given to defend a specific claim. So in classical logic, modus ponens, if P, then Q, P exists, therefore Q exists. So if the ground is wet, then it rained. The ground is wet, therefore it rained. You could challenge the premises here by saying, well, is this actually wet ground? Even before you get to the logic of the statement, could there be other reasons for that wet ground? And that gets us to the conclusions. When you interpret the premises, given those assumptions, what are the results? So, in the example I just gave, the premises are, okay, rain can cause the ground to be wet, and you can say, I observed that the ground is wet. But the conclusion is faulty because it could be that someone has just been watering the lawn, or there's been a water balloon fight, or something else happened to cause that. More than once, I have walked outside on one of the Cal State campuses and thought, how did the sidewalk get wet? Because we're in Southern California, it rains like twice a year. Okay, a little more than twice a year, but seems that way. And then realize, oh, there are lawn sprinklers set up here and here and here. That makes a little more sense. I had to adjust my premises to make a more accurate conclusion. So as you are disagreeing productively, you have a few options. You can critique the assumptions or the premises to kind of take the support away from the argument, saying, well, yeah, this makes sense if this is how your world works, but actually that's not, you don't have all the data here, or your assumption about this, your observation is incorrect. If you've been around little kids, then you know that they are always sort of making these assumptions and testing them as they learn more about the world. So if you have a cat at home, every animal is going to be kitty. It gets really confusing when you go to the zoo and you say, why does that kitty have such a long neck and why is it eating from the trees? And you have to explain, well, not everything is a kitty. This is a special kind of kitty called a giraffe. And then maybe the kid thinks that every kitty is a giraffe and you get into a whole other problem. But we learn from these experiences, say, okay, now I can assume different things or correct my assumptions given the data that I have. You can also critique the conclusion, and you can do that by looking at the logic of the overall argument. Or you can say, you know, right, the premises are good, the assumptions are good, but that does not follow from the argument that you set up. So there are different ways to go about this. Let me show you some templates of how that might work. You can cite evidence, right? And science, that's what we do a lot of. We're going to talk about using sources next lecture. You can challenge the assumptions directly. So this starts by articulating them, even if the author has not done this. And this gets a little tricky territory because the author maybe can come back and say, well, no, I'm not assuming that at all. You can also look at contradiction. Our basic form of logic is A and not A cannot be true at the same time. So let's make it a little personal. If you have a B in the class, you don't have an A and you don't have a C. Therefore, if you've agreed that 850 points equals a B, and I give you a C, then you could say, oh, wait a minute, that's not right. I earned a higher grade than that. Now, if I happen to say, you know what, this person did really good work all quarter, I'm going to give them an A, probably not going to get a whole lot of complaints. So far, nobody said, damn it, give me that B. I only earned 850 points. They'll take the A. Another way to disagree is to say your focus is wrong. So this is a particular part of the problem you're looking at, but actually there's something underlying this. And you see this in a lot of social critiques. So you might say, well, we have this disparity in results. And let's just say for the sake of argument, we're looking at college graduation rates among students of different racial or ethnic groups. There's a lot of education scholarship on this question. And one scholar might say that, well, we've got 25% lower graduation rates for Black male students than for white male students. And I think the problem is that we don't have enough Black faculty members. And they might say, well, this is important because of representation and because students need to see people like them who are succeeding. Another scholar might come along later and say, well, you're focusing so much on the number of Black faculty members. What you're actually missing is that there's another mechanism going on here. Maybe they want to argue that fewer Black students are graduating because the culture around them is saying you don't have to value education, or because there are people saying you don't want to succeed, or because there's some institutional racism going on. And whatever argument is actually right here, they're looking at different things, and they're going to find different causes for the effects that they're examining. You can also argue from history. So if this particular argument or approach or method or theory has failed in the past, then you can bring up that example. We see this a lot in political theory, political philosophy. We have tried this system and 50 million people died. Or we promoted this, but look at all these usually negative effects here. So this is sort of the flip side of the agreement template of saying this is good because of the past research showing this benefit and this benefit and this benefit. And this is kind of my favorite. This person is wrong because their argument results in very bad things. And sometimes these arguments are most rhetorically effective when you don't actually say what those very bad things are. Because you just want to get it in your audience's head that if we do this, everything will go badly. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will go out the window. The Constitution will be shredded. That, oh my gosh, we might elect a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian. Okay, we're not actually going to elect a Libertarian, but theoretically, we could elect a Libertarian if we don't donate to this, if we don't get out and vote, if we don't support this policy. The classic example of this, and it never stops working, is won't somebody please think of the children? You want to get your audience in not even a frame of mind, but a frame of emotion that will say, no, we have to stop those very bad things. Therefore, we must do this. Now, these are templates. You can use them for good reasons or for bad reasons. It's a good reason, arguably at least, to say that right now we should stay home, avoid public gatherings, wear masks, wash your hands, et cetera, to avoid the very bad thing of spreading coronavirus. I think we're mostly on the same page on that. But where a lot of the discussion is happening right now is, well, can we do this, avoid the very bad thing in a way that also avoids other very bad things like crashing the economy or putting, what are we up to, 7 million people out of work in the US, or spending how many over $1 trillion we've already spent on bailouts and relief packages. And so that's where we can have those discussions, have those disagreements. And that takes me to the third point here. Sometimes this is the most interesting way to approach an argument, saying, yes, I agree with part of this, but there are parts that I don't like. And here, sometimes the wording is important. You can say, yes, I like this, but I don't like this part, to emphasize disagreement. Or you can say, no, I don't really like that part, but I like your conclusion, to say, I mostly agree with this. This is also a place where it's legitimate to say, you know, I am ambivalent. That means literally I have two minds about this, or I have mixed feelings about this. And I think this is a really important technique because it's easy to reduce arguments to there's one solution or the other. One party has to be right. One person has to be right about all this. And in reality, we have a lot of trade-offs anytime we try to make a decision or to establish a policy or whatever we're doing, because that is how the real world actually works. Give you an example of how that might look on a college campus. So, not so much this quarter, but in previous quarters, and presumably when we actually get back to campus, hopefully fall semester, we have parking permits. And I think as of the last quarter I looked up, it was something like $130, $150 or something for a student parking permit for the quarter. And, you know, that's not a small amount of money. That could be an investment of certain parts of your life. That's a sacrifice you would have to make and be able to spend less on groceries or rent or whatever. And so if an administrator or faculty senate or something said, you know what, we should just make parking free on campus, you probably get a lot of support among both the students and faculty staff because we pay for parking too. because we like free stuff. And I could go political here, but I will try to keep this focus on the rhetoric for the moment. The question we should be asking, though, is not just, should we make parking free, but what would it cost to do that? What resources do we have here? What abilities or benefits do we have in the current system where we pay for parking that we might lose? Well, one way to do that is to think, how do we use the money that we get from parking permits? We have parking lots to maintain. We have security. Certainly, if parking is free, then anyone could just drive in and park on campus. So there may be people who decide, I want to park here and take the bus out to another part of San Bernardino, or I have someplace to go nearby in walking distance or biking distance or whatever, and so I'm going to take advantage of this free parking. When I lived in Ohio, the apartment I lived in for the first 7 years was about a mile from the Ohio State football stadium. Ohio State loves its football. And so we would constantly get people trying to park in the resident spaces and then walk to the football stadium, because parking by the stadium is like $20-25 on a good day. And in fact, there was a big shopping center next door to my apartment complex, and they started renting out parking spots for on football days. They just have attendants out there, and like if you parked there, you had to prove that you were actually going to one of the stores, the shopping center, and you had to be out in a certain amount of time, or else they would give you a ticket. It got a little bit crazy. So you could say that part of what we are paying for with the parking fees is that privilege. We are able to have our cars there. Hopefully they will be safe. Nobody is going to break into them. We can rely on having that spot. And that is a trade-off that we make. Now, if we got rid of the fees, we could see some problems there. But we could also see problems if we go from $150 to $300. Because suddenly you have a lot of students who are saying, you know what, I can't afford that, or I got better things to do with my money, or it's not worth that. And so they're going to make other decisions. They're going to say, maybe I'm going to have to carpool. Maybe I'm going to have to take an Uber to campus. Probably not going to be that much cheaper, right? Maybe I'm going to take the bus. Maybe I'm going to say, I'm just not going to go to Cal State, or I'm just going to take online classes, or I'm going to find a community college that's closer to my building, my apartment, or that lets me park free. And so that's going to save me some money on my bills. Back when I was in college at University of Illinois, I think I only bought a parking permit. Actually, I don't think I ever bought a parking permit once in college, because it was just too much money to justify what I would get out of it. But parking was free at the local community college. So theoretically, you could park over there and take a bus into campus, or you could park in one of the residential neighborhoods nearby. They hated that, but we could do it on certain streets and walk into campus. And so we're always going to find these trade-offs. And agreeing and disagreeing can be a good way to highlight what those trade-offs are and why they might be relevant to this particular argument. You can use this technique as a basis for criticism, as I mentioned earlier, to show that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, or the premises are weak, even the conclusion is correct. But it's also a good way to say, there are multiple potential benefits for each side, because we don't always live in a black and white world. We have certain ways of approaching, I want to be able to do this, I want to uphold this value, but I also think it's important to uphold this other value. And there's not always a policy that matches both of those exactly right. We might say in terms of immigration, I want to be able to protect and to help people who are in legitimately dangerous or bad situations who want a better life. but I also want to maintain the safety and security of the United States. And we have to have those conversations. Sometimes we have to find compromises that will fit both of those goals. So, as before, some templates for agreeing and disagreeing at the same time. You can say, there's a part of this I like. I agree with this up to a point, but I don't like this conclusion. Conversely, you can go about that backwards. You can say, this is mainly wrong here, but actually I like where this ends up. So you're looking at different parts of the argument. You can say that there are parts of this that have some problems, but it's a better option than all of the other ones that we have in front of us. See also the 2016 election. Two extremely, deeply flawed candidates, and a whole bunch of voters saying, oh my gosh, do I really have to pick between one of them? And this is why the third party votes were so relatively high in that election, but also why a lot of people were saying, you know what, I'm going to have to hold my nose and vote for fill in the blank here. You can also look at alternate explanations here. And this is a good way to say, you know what, this is a good case, a good argument, but on the balance, I like this plan better. This can be a very useful technique if you're deciding among different situations, especially if there are people attached to them and you don't want to hurt their feelings any more than you can help it. Say, you know, I like this argument, this does well, but I think this is a better approach here. And you could just say, I have mixed feelings here. This is an admirable goal. This is important. This is a priority for me. But we also need to do this. The example I gave earlier about immigration fits into that template. Finally, you can emphasize agreement on part of this. We agree here. We both want to do this. But when it comes to these other issues, we disagree about the best way to go about this. Believe it or not, there was a time when politics worked like this, when a Republican could say about a Democrat or vice versa, we both want to protect America or improve the economy, but we disagree about how to get there. And this is why I think my approach is a better option. Now everything is kind of an existential crisis. And if you support any part of anyone's agenda, then you have to support the whole thing. And we're just kind of in a big mess. But that would get us into some serious soapbox territory. So I will stop there. So I hope you can use these techniques and these templates. You can refer to your textbook for some more explanations there to structure your agreement or disagreement. As we move into our first round of discussion on Diamond and Pierce, I want to give you a little bit of background on them so we can start our discussions more productively and hopefully give you some ideas for setting up your arguments in the assignments for this week. So Easter's End came out in a magazine called Discover. And Discover launched in the, I believe the late 80s or early 90s. And at the time, there was a lot of demand for explanation of science aimed at what Wikipedia labels educated non-professionals. So people who weren't professional scientists, who were interested in some of these issues, but maybe didn't have the technical vocabulary or the qualifications to like pick up an academic journal. Because that's as we'll see later in the quarter, that's a big gap in the style of reading and the kind of material. So this was sort of between Scientific American and Popular Science. Unfortunately, the market did not act very kindly to this. The magazine lost money for most of its history. Right now, it is owned by Callback Media. It's still being published. But at the time this came out, it was actually owned by Disney. Disney had a lot of properties there. And so it had kind of a different approach at the time. This is how they describe themselves currently. Discover attracts intelligent and curious readers, forward thinkers, and public advocates engaging in a dialogue of action that influences opinion leaders and encourages innovation. They are active in their communities, carry a strong voice concerning political issues, and are very active in environmental groups. And especially in that last sentence, you can see that there's certainly an activist angle to the current magazine that really wasn't there in the mid-90s when Diamond is publishing. And I bring that up because, as you'll see when you do the reading, he has a political agenda behind his story. It's not just saying this to say, hey, look at this really interesting, kind of cool, and kind of sad history of Easter Island. So I found these two magazine covers. The one on the left is from the issue where this actually came out. You see this was the cover story. And I love the teaser here. Science reveals the unwitting suicide of an entire society. And you got sort of the statue staring out at the readers. But even you can just get a sense of the kind of work that they were doing. We have at the top of the cover here, the world of science, a little teaser, sexual abuse primate style. Okay. And the other two articles they mentioned, wicked storms in space and life on a melting continent. So this is designed to be appealing to the general public, but also sort of have a scientific component. Compare this to the January-February 2020 issue. They now call this not the world of science, but science for the curious. And they highlight the science that matters with this nice little visualization of DNA. And they kind of review their top 50 stories. DNA tests, CBD. Okay, I guess there's science involved in that. Space flight, gene therapy, Mars exploration, and more. It's a much more kind of, look, this is exciting, this is cool. Whereas here, this is sort of a more somber series. You can even look at the color schemes here. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to approach this and look at the specific content of Diamond's argument as we go. For Pierce, which is the other thing we'll be talking about and the subject of your first exercise, his article showed up in The Guardian. The Guardian is a pretty far-left newspaper. It's published in England. And this one appeared in 2010, so it's about 10 years old. And it was a series of articles on ClimateGate and climate change. I'll talk about that in a minute. I forget now how many. It was like, I want to say 15 or 20 articles. I may be wrong on that number. But it was a pretty large set of investigative reports and kind of looking at the debates that were going on at the time. One thing we'll talk about in our discussion is the title. And so we have here this language of war. Another one he published was called How the ClimateGate Scandal is Bogus and Claimed based on Climate Skeptics' Lies, which gives you a sense of where he's coming down if you didn't get it for the first 5 minutes of this article. So the actual context here was called ClimateGate. There was a hacking incident at the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in Great Britain. It was kind of similar to WikiLeaks back in 2015, 2016. So a hacker got a hold of emails and other files by climate researchers at the Institute and released some of the data, suggesting that some of them had manipulated or misrepresented the data that they had to promote an agenda that supported this idea of anthropogenic global warming. But there was a lot of controversy here. And this sort of brought many of the discussions, many of the projects that were being done into the public sphere. And people not only were able to see what did the scientists conclude, but how are they talking to each other and about each other? What are some of the personalities involved? And Pierce gets into some of that as well. Pierce is obviously very pro-AJW and frankly hates a lot of the people who disagree with him on this topic. And this sort of launched his career. He obviously was a journalist, fairly high standing before this, but he actually went on to write several books about this, what he called Earth's Population Crisis, has been the topic, I believe, of his most recent book. So he's still active here. So this is a very politicized context, certainly for him. And you'll see that in the way he presents the two sides, which we'll talk about in our discussion. I have some sample discussion questions here. You don't necessarily have to answer all of these, but I think this would give you a starting point for a response paper for Diamond, or certainly for evaluating Pierce's tone. So I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I want to put them on the notes here so that you can look at them and use them to guide your reading. So there's the one for Diamond and for Pierce. And that is going to get us started. But what I want to do mainly in our discussion is to hear what you think. So maybe you've started working on your response paper. I hope you have by the time we started our discussion. Use that to test out your ideas. I would like everyone to contribute to our discussion as we go there. And so I hope those will be helpful starting points. So that is all I have for you for today. As you get ready, find out ways that you can respond productively to those arguments, especially for your first response paper. And we will meet as a group in the regular class times to talk through these essays. I'll see you then.